Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the first episode of our second season of Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. I hope you had a nice summer.
Oh, it was great, busy. We had another grandchild.
Mazal tov. How many is that?
Well, 5, but you're not supposed to count. How was yours?
It was fun. It was fun spending time with the kids. Intimate Judaism itself had an exciting summer, even though we haven't released an episode since May. That's when we ended our first season. We were featured in an article in the Jerusalem Post magazine by Brian Blum. We were featured on Australian Broadcasting Corporation's internet site. We also, you and I, were featured in Francesca Goldschmidt-Cosman's podcast called The Francesca Show. She asked us to come on her podcast to discuss the issues of Kol Isha, the halachic issues of a man's listening to a woman's singing voice. It was almost a mini episode of Intimate Judaism to keep us warmed up for the season.
Exactly. So if you enjoy our podcast, you might enjoy this episode of the Francesca Show, as well as some of her other episodes, which are actually quite interesting.
And you have some exciting news about a book that you and Dr. David Ribner are putting out.
Yes, it is Elul, and Elul also is an acronym for Ani Lidodi Vidodi Li, and that is the name of our forthcoming book, I Am for My Beloved. It is a guide for enhanced marital intimacy, and it is for married couples. The title is A Guide to Enhanced Intimacy for Married Couples, which really brings us into our conversation, which is ironically the marginalization of singles. And our book, and the title of our book, I acknowledge, does that. It marginalizes singles. But that kind of is a good
segue almost.
Segue to our topic, which is really about, well, what about singles? And what about their intimate lives? And what about their sense of self as sexual human beings? Can we talk about this today?
It's such a difficult topic in many ways because Judaism has for so many years rightly been proud of its strong family life, enhancing family values, and more. And yet at the same time, for people who are single, we don't want them to feel like addendums or additions to the community, people who aren't fully part of the community. So often, I think singles are looked at by the community or by our micro-communities as either not yet married or once were married, as opposed to individuals. And there are good reasons why we think that way. We can't be blamed because Torah and halacha emphasize family life so much. At the same time, disenfranchising singles is certainly not a positive consequence, and we have to find ways to allow everybody in our community, whether they're married or whether they're single, to feel and to actually be fully participant members of our community, both religiously and socially. Before we talk about that topic, let me first remind everybody to go to our website, intimatejudaism.com. I'm sure Talli's book will eventually be on sale there. When's the book coming out?
Well, hopefully the book will be out in the next month or so, and we will be very excited to host Dr. David Ribner on the show with us, and we can discuss aspects of the books. You can interview us.
That will be fun. Make sure you go to our website, again, intimatejudaism.com. There's a full podcast archive, show notes from this and other episodes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. Please continue to send us your questions and comments by writing to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Let's get into our topic now, Talli.
Yeah, and I thank you for those who have written in, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is based on the information that you have provided us.
Before we begin discussing some of the psychological and other elements of being single in the Jewish community, I wanted to first preface it by offering a very brief guide to where some of this idea of Judaism's emphasis on married life comes from. And there are really 3 basic ideas from which it comes. The first is the mitzvah of pru orvu. According to most counts, it's the first mitzvah in the Torah. It's a mitzvah for a man to have children, the way we paskin, based on Yevamot Daf Samach Aleph Amud Bet. It means that a man has to have at least one boy and girl, each one of whom is able to themselves have children. That's the mitzvah of pru orvu, to have a male and a female child who themselves can have children. The second source of the emphasis on marriage is Breshit Perek Bet Pasuk Yudchet, Breshit 2:18, where the pasuk says, quoting God, "Lo tov hayot hadam levado, e'aseh lo ezer kenegdo." It is not right for the man, Adam, to be by himself, to be alone. I will make a helpmeet corresponding to him. And even though this seems to be not exactly a halachic pasuk, there are many Rishonim who understand, based on Gemaras, that it actually is a halachic mandate for a person to be married based on that pasuk, and even those who do not see it as a Torah obligation understand it as a rabbinic obligation. And the third source is the idea of hirhurei avera, that a person who is not married, or specifically a man who is not married, has a stronger likelihood of having improper sexual thoughts. So the Rambam and others say that this itself is a source for mandating marriage, at least for a man. If he's married, that will prevent him from having thoughts that are sexual and improper. These are the basic three sources. Everyone, once again, should go to our website, intimatejudaism.com. We will have full sources that will be available, all these sources in the Gemara as well as in the Rambam. So that's the basic idea. That's where it comes from. But this halachic reality, which I'm giving a very, very brief overview of, is really only one piece of something much more fundamental, Talli, which is that in classic Jewish thought, there's simply an assumption that people are married. The idea that someone will be single, it happens, but it's unusual and needs to be explained. Classically, the Tana ben Azai, one of Rabbi Akiva's students, wasn't married because he was too busy learning Torah. The Rambam even mentions that. But just not being married itself isn't considered acceptable. It's not considered a real option. The fact that he wasn't married because he was learning Torah, there had to be some sort of excuse for that fact. I remember learning a story about the Chazon Ish, one of the great halachic authorities in the early days of Israel. He was telling his students how important it is for Jewish men to have a beard. It's a Jewish thing to have a beard. And one person asked him, what about for a man who's not married? To which the Chazon Ish replied, not being married isn't Jewish at all. In other words, this is the prevalent attitude that, of course you're going to be married. The idea of not being married is simply an untenable option. It's not really an option at all. The problem is now we live in a time where, regardless of whether it's by choice or by default, there are so many singles who feel disenfranchised. Sometimes, halachically, there are certain halachic issues that are relevant to marital status, such as, for example, it's ideal on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that the chazan be a married man rather than a single man. It's also ideal he have a beard too. There are all sorts of requirements. So there are halachic reasons why this is true. But this is all sort of beside the point. It's just demonstrating the fact that our world is based on families. Our world is so often in the Orthodox community based on Jewish family life, married life. Saying the halacha says you have to get married is not going to be very helpful for singles. They're not interested in hearing that because that's not the point. I'm simply trying to explain where this thought process comes from. But we're past that now. The fact is, there are many singles who are single by choice or otherwise who feel that their concerns are not being addressed by the Orthodox community. How can we make sure that they are not disenfranchised, that the issues that concern Orthodox singles, both socially and halachically, are being dealt with?
I think that we have to acknowledge what the values are surrounding marriage, specifically from the sources. And even though the first source that you quoted was pru or vu, you should be fruitful and multiply, your second source was actually from the story of creation. It's not good for a man to be alone. I'm going to create a helpmate. And of course, whether you look at this story literally or whether you look at it as some sort of narrative that explains the beginning of creation, obviously there is a role for a male partner, there is a role for a female partner. A man cannot be alone because a man cannot procreate alone. A man has desires which he needs a woman to fulfill for him. All of these sources are obviously directed to the experience of being a man, as is not unusual for our texts to do. And women are sort of an object, as is not unusual for our sources to do, of a man being able to fulfill those commandments and obligations. And of course, we're not getting into, this is our religion, this is the basis of our religion. And again, one might have much to say about the Rambam getting married in order to avoid hirhurei avera. However it sounds, obviously in contemporary times, it doesn't ring in a very positive way. And obviously we know that men, as well as women, are wired to connect. Humans are wired to connect. So really this obligation to connect is not a difficult one to perform because most people are wired to want to be able to create safety and intimacy and love and connection with another person. You'll agree with me on that,
Of course,
right?
And I don't disagree with what you're saying. I will say that, as we've mentioned before, many of these sources are looking for the technical halachic source of a particular idea. So when the Rambam says that one of the reasons a person must be married is that he has to avoid hirhurei avera, it's technically attaching the requirement of marriage onto that idea. The same way that, for example, there is a requirement in halacha that a couple see each other before they get married. What's the reason why? You have to love your neighbor as yourself, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with marriage, but that's the technical reason, because we're afraid if they don't see each other and then they find they're repulsed by each other, then they won't love each other, and that's a mitzvah in the Torah. And someone might say, wait, are you telling me that marriage is only based on loving your neighbor as yourself, and simply the love of a marriage has no other sources? The point is that Chazal are finding the source on which they place it. It's not as though that's the only point coming out. We're trying to find a technical halachic nail on which to hang the idea, but the idea obviously transcends that initial point. So when the Rambam will say that, yeah, we have to get married because of avoiding hirurei avera, I don't think he means that's the be-all and end-all of marriage. That's the starting point on a technical halachic level.
No, and I think that we've spoken a lot about the Rambam and how his way of life is so very different today. The whole attitude towards women and how women are viewed is very different today. But I think that we can acknowledge that both for men and for women who are in their late 20s or 30s or 40s, who are not in a relationship, in a marital relationship, they're dealing with not being able to fulfill on a halachic level, but on a more humane level, they may long for connection, long for children, long for being able to act out what they might be fantasizing around, what you refer to as avoiding inappropriate thoughts or hirurei avera. I don't know exactly what that means, but I would say there's a very natural desire to connect with others, and we are wired for that as well. So I don't know that I would call them hirurei avera as much as I would call them normative fantasies of what it would be like to connect with another person.
Right. I think that's a reasonable modern translation of what the Rambam and the Gemara itself, on which is based, is referring to. Yeah, we have to try to take the idiom in which they spoke and put it into modern terms. I certainly agree with that.
With that, we need to acknowledge the experience of singles, and we need to acknowledge the experience of singles on a social level, even with the marginalization that occurs around events, around holidays, around being invited places, or they're invited places and they're seated at the children's table, or they're invited to an event and they are put up in a room with the teenage kids and they're 40 years old, but they're single. So it's really very important that we have a lot more sensitivity to the experience of people being people, and just because they're not married should not take away their status as people who may be doing incredibly well in many areas of their lives. So that's one thing we need to be very conscious of. The other thing is that singles are not a demographic. Everyone's an individual. But we do need to acknowledge that in the different cuts of society, like if we talk about the more yeshivish world, they call it the shidduch crisis. In the more modern Orthodox world, it's not so much about shidduch dating, but there is an issue of modern Orthodox singles and many of the experiences that they have around what it means to be single, and also what it means in terms of what we really want to be able to talk about is how to deal with issues of intimacy, issues of sexuality in dating, whether you're never married, whether you're divorced, whether you're widowed. I would like to raise these issues and talk about them because there's a lot that we need to be able to examine.
I'm sure, Talli, you deal with a lot of singles. So can you tell me and our listeners what some of these issues are for the singles who live in the Jewish community?
I don't want to talk too much about the quote-unquote shidduch crisis or the issues already being spoken about. And there's several reasons for this. One is that I think that singles already experience so much judgment around the fact that they're being single. So conversations about what are the reasons that people are still single, such as, well, they have difficulty with commitment, or they have difficulty with creating intimacy, they're too defensive, they're on the internet all the time. There is research out there, and it's not just in the Jewish communities. There's research about why millennials don't have intimate relationships, and that goes back to technology and how people have forgotten the art of human interaction. So those are all things I don't really want to spend that much time on, especially because I don't want there to be a kind of quote unquote blame the victim conversation here. There are many reasons why people are single. And by the way, it actually doesn't take all that much talent and creativity to get married at the age of 18 or 19. The truth is that some of the single people I met are still single because they are quite careful and smart and not willing to just jump into something without being properly prepared. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the questions should not necessarily be, what are you doing wrong or what's wrong with this person? Because that's just not validating the experience of many people who really just are not finding the person who they can connect with.
I mean, not only it's not validating, you're also saying it's just not true. It's not accurate.
It's not 100%. Look, I think we all need to be able to reflect on ourselves. We all need to be able to do a process with ourselves. If we don't have self-awareness, that's certainly going to have an impact on how we connect with other people. In fact, when you said, V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, that implies that you do love yourself, which is almost a prerequisite for loving another person. You have to have intimacy with yourself. You have to have awareness of yourself, and you have to be able to assert and communicate your feelings, your beliefs in order to be able to connect with another person. Even though there is plenty to talk about, if we were to do a podcast on how do I create intimacy with another person, how can I get married, singles who are listening to this podcast will have already heard day and night from other people what they need to do or what they don't need to do. And that's not why we're going to talk. I want to talk about something that people are not talking about. Because what happens is that if there is a workshop on sexuality and intimacy, or if there is a book written on sexuality and intimacy, it generally excludes singles from that conversation. There are not many things taking place that validates or acknowledges the sexual experience. When I say experience, I don't mean necessarily experiences. I mean the experience of one's sexual self as part of the self in their developmental process. And again, the idea of getting married at a young age is predicated on people developing in the context of having a marital partner from a very young age. But when that does not happen, what happens to a person's sexual development? Does it get put on hold? Or does it develop b'chol zot anyway? And in what way does it develop? And what do the prohibitions against sexual activity, even with oneself, if we're speaking about the male prohibition, how does that impact on one's sexual sense of self? And these are very important conversations.
I would assume that the lack of conversation about so much of this is the fear that by acknowledging sexuality among people who are not married, one is implicitly approving of it. In halachic sources, there is no approval of non-marital sex. Let's also acknowledge the obvious. Sex is a very powerful experience, and when done outside of the context of halacha, as a result of this power, people will take it extraordinarily seriously and discount perhaps the rest of their religious life. It's important for me to clarify that just because somebody violates the halacha when it comes to premarital sexual activity, I'm not approving of that. I'm not saying that halacha would approve of that, but it doesn't mean that the person, therefore, is disenfranchising himself or herself such that they are no longer orthodox in any other way, and they should therefore drop everything. That's not the meaning. That's not how it should be understood. Just because a person doesn't do what halacha says in case X has no impact on what they should do in halacha's demands for case Y. I want to make sure that's clear.
Getting back to what you were saying about Ben Azai and why people are single, he had a good reason. He prioritized learning over marriage. That might have been a defense mechanism. It might have been a narrative, a story he told himself. I don't know. But there are reasons that some people don't get married that might have to do with sexual orientation that is not necessarily out of the closet. But most of the singles that we're talking about are heterosexual. They are not asexual. They want to have a formal relationship. They want to get married. As you get older, one single person who I spoke to said that she heard a quote that went like this: as single women get older, they get more brittle, and as single men get older, they get moldy. I would never say this, but she's single and she said it. And I think that what is meant by the brittleness is that you almost have to create layers of defenses, because how easy is it to be getting out there and being vulnerable and exposing yourself when you are potentially going to be rejected? And I think that's true for both men and women. Again, these are certainly aspects of personal development that will impact on intimacy, because when you come to the table with all your vulnerability and all your authenticity, and then you're rejected, that doesn't feel very good, and you might be very careful not to do that next time. So how that relates actually to sexuality is what I'd like to be able to talk about with you.
I think that as a rabbi, Talli, I have a somewhat incomplete perspective in terms of understanding the real lives of Orthodox singles. Because on the one hand, I have some students who are very open and honest with me about their encounters and experiences. I also am sure that I have other students who, when asking me questions or talking to me about certain issues, try to couch it and conceal the nature of some of their experiences. And of course, that's absolutely their right. But I don't know if I'm really understanding fully what the average and typical life of Orthodox singles is really all about, what really goes on. Talli, what's happening with Orthodox singles in the world? Obviously, that's a very, very broad term, but are Orthodox singles, by and large, are they sexually active? Are they sexually active in all ways, in certain ways? What is the experience of so many singles? And again, we spoke in an earlier episode, in episode 4, about Shomer Negia. A lot of that, however, was talking about teenagers. And also parents' relationship with that.
Yeah, we had feedback on that, that we sort of ignored the experience of adults in their 30s and in their 40s who are single by talking about Shomer Negia amongst 17-year-olds.
So now I'm talking about those 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 40-year-olds who are single. I'm wondering, are they sexually active?
I'll answer that, but I want to go back to what you said about being a rabbi and having that position. That's part of the issue. We need to be able to provide places where singles can ask questions to rabbinic figures, whether it has to do with should I go to the mikvah or should I not go to the mikvah, or whether it has to do with certain sexual acts, or whether it has to do with being able to integrate a certain way of life into their overall hashkafa, and they want to be able to talk about that with a Rav. We have to create an openness to hearing that, yes, there are plenty of singles out there who are having sex. And there are, by the way, plenty of singles out there who are not having sex. And there's also a lot of people who are having sexual activity anywhere along that spectrum in between sexual intercourse and being completely shomer and not doing anything. That's there, and it needs to be acknowledged so that it can create safe, containing spaces for single people to talk about their experiences, whether they choose to do so with a therapist or whether they choose to do so with clergy.
I would assume, though, Talli, and please tell me if I'm wrong, that many of these Orthodox singles who are sexually active in one way or another are probably feeling in their own minds they're living a dual life. Meaning, on the one hand, when they go to shul, when they're dealing with their Orthodox friends, they give all the appearances of being someone who's fully shomer negia, or at least not fully sexually active. And on the other hand, they may be doing something completely different when Orthodox people are not watching them. Now, I'm not saying that Orthodox people should judge. I'm more speaking from the internal perspective of the single. Is this right that many singles are living a life which is almost a duality, splitting, having a life where they're presenting themselves in one way and acting in a different kind of way? Lest anybody misunderstand what I mean, I am certainly not suggesting that they should, so to speak, come clean and tell everybody what they're doing or they're living a lie. Of course not. Their private lives are their private lives. Anyone's private life is his or her private life. And it's every person's prerogative to keep that part or any part of his life private if he or she so chooses. What I mean is, from an internal psychological perspective, it must be difficult because halacha is very clear. There is no room for premarital sexual activity. But that having been said, it might not be particularly healthy for a person to live a dual life like that. How does a person balance that problem of, on the one hand, living an Orthodox life and wanting to be an Orthodox Jew, and feeling if that person were honest even with him or herself, then they may as well just not be an Orthodox Jew because everything is a joke and I'm living a lie.
Okay, so we've spoken in our first season a lot about black and white thinking and about the ability to nuance your practice in a way that feels good to you in terms of being an integrated human being. We all have parts, and some of our parts we live with in an easier way than other of our parts. But when we accept all of those parts, we could live a more authentic and integrated life. What you bring up is true for some people. It's not true for all people. There are many single people who are sexually active and under the appropriate circumstance would talk about that in a way that's not split. It's just that it's quite a private thing, so they might not talk about it because it's not anybody's business. But they may want to be able to talk about it without judgment of others, and they have accepted this as part of their experience. And that would be more of a healthy experience for them and for their partners. The problem comes in not only individually in terms of how do I reconcile the part of me that wants to be sexual or might be, quote unquote, acting out sexually, with the part of me that's religious or that's very halachic or that doesn't think that it's an okay thing to do. That's one aspect. But another aspect is, how does this play out in dating relationships? So one interesting phenomena that I see in my practice, but also women wrote us and talked about, was that I will go out on shidduch dates. I'll be this frum girl, dress tznius, but I'm also on the side hooking up with somebody who's even not Jewish or somebody who's not religious to fulfill that part of me. So that is an issue in terms of one's own self. How do I integrate my need for sexual connection with the part of me that I come with to shidduch dates, which is really not the whole part of me. It's not the integrated whole. But the other issue is what happens in the dynamics of the dating scene, which is that there's almost this phenomenon of, I'll fool around with you, but if I fool around with you, you're not the one I'm going to marry. And this is a real problematic issue. And this holds for men as well as for women. So
well, when you say, I will fool around with you, but I won't marry you if I fool around with you, is that coming from a place of, I wouldn't want to marry someone who would fool around?
Yes.
It's like the famous quote from Groucho Marx, I don't care to belong to any club that will have me as a member.
And that really is a problem, because what it does is it sets up a splitting situation almost socioculturally.
What does somebody do then? Meaning, you say this creates a real problem in terms of the person's personality, their psychological health, splitting. Well, what's the person supposed to do? This person, male or female, really does not want to marry someone who has the values that they're living. They don't agree with the values the way that they're actually acting. On the one hand, we don't want them to change their values because these are the values that they espouse. On the other hand, if it's psychologically unhealthy, what's a person supposed to do?
I don't tell people what to do, but if they were to go through some sort of process of self-reflection, they would become self-aware enough to be able to reconcile the sides of themselves, understand better the sides of themselves that they don't take responsibility for in those moments. Some of the people who I have spoken to have an almost dissociated experience of doing things, hooking up, going on a date with somebody, being very attracted to that person. You know, there's something I want to tell you, bichlal, in general, about relationships and how they tend to evolve. I don't know if I talked about this here before, but I have spoken about it before. There's a model that's known as the triangle of love. And the triangle of love looks at the development of romantic relationships as containing three basic elements. One is passion, one is intimacy, and one is commitment. So what generally happens in the Western world is that a relationship begins based on an initial chemistry and attraction. So in the secular world, two people will fall for each other. they'll act out their passion. They might go to bed together and they might begin this wild relationship, and there's a great deal of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that's related to novelty and excitement. And there's also an idealization that occurs. My partner can do no wrong. They like to say their names over and over again. This is like this very strong hit ahavut, falling in love. And this can certainly happen in the modern Orthodox world as well, with or without any kind of touch. But what generally happens is that those relationships either survive or they don't. So when they have been idealized and then your partner does something and shows their true self to some extent, and that doesn't fall into what you expected or you devalue them because of it, the relationship can end. But many relationships will go from that experience of being in love to the next level, which is the creation of intimacy. And what happens in the creation of intimacy is that we are able to get to know our partners on a much deeper level. We're able to see them in all states, not necessarily with their makeup on, or we can see them lose their temper, and we can get to know them more as their true selves emerge. And we have a lot of curiosity about them. During that period of the creation of intimacy, we might also experience conflict with them and learn to resolve conflict with them.
That's probably an integral part of intimacy itself.
A very integral part of intimacy. You know, I tell people they want to get engaged and they've never even had a fight. That's not a very good indicator of readiness to get engaged. And then when you have gone through these stages of falling in love and then falling into a more intimate relationship, and then you want to be able to make it last, then you go to the third stage, which is commitment, getting married.
Can you explain this triangle a little bit, Talli? Because I'm
Sure.
confused. I understand there's passion, which leads to intimacy, which leads to commitment. When you say that's how it works, is this the advised way it should work, or the way it works in practice?
No, it's the way it's one of the ways in which it works.
Because certainly in some of the more right-wing Orthodox circles, they don't work with the assumption that passion leads to intimacy and that leads to commitment. They're not necessarily working with that order.
Well, when I was at Neve, when I was doing some training at Neve Yerushalayim, they used to say that the secular world did the passion and then the intimacy and then the commitment. The modern Orthodox world did the intimacy and then the commitment and then the passion. And then the Haredi world did the commitment and then the passion and then the intimacy. That was kind of the joke over there. But the idea is that there are many ways to create this triangle of love.
So the direction in which you described it, where passion leads to intimacy, leads to commitment, that's not recommended necessarily. You're saying that's the way that it often works.
I'm bringing this up because sometimes there's couples that start out with this incredible amount of passion, and the couple could potentially move forward to intimacy and then commitment. It might even be that passion is indicative of a very strong attraction and connection, but they don't go on to that stage because they invalidate the relationship because they believe it's just physical, so that can't be okay. But I also brought this up because I think that many relationships begin from a place of intimacy, being good friends, and then it can go from a place of being good friends into a place of more passion and desire.
That's a very important point. It sounds like you're saying, Talli, that an Orthodox person who's experiencing this split, who invalidates his or her own sexual experience, will likely end up stopping in any relationship at the passion stage without moving forward into intimacy and commitment. Because this person is going to say, in all likelihood, I want someone who doesn't act as I do, even though I want someone who has the same values that I do. Is that what's happening?
That's why I'm telling the story, because that's what happens out there. And if they haven't done this work on themselves to be able to integrate this part of themselves as this is human and this is what I'm choosing to do, or this is what I'm responsible for, that's going to perpetuate the experience of singleness in a sense, because you're invalidating a relationship. And then there are people who invalidate relationships because they don't know, especially people who are on what's called Chapter 2, if they've been divorced or if they've been widowed. And to be honest, you asked me about my experience of what I know in the Orthodox world, look, I think that there are many divorcees who don't have sex, but I think that there are many Orthodox divorcees who do. And part of why they might do that is because, fool me once, and their divorce may have also had to do with incompatibility with intimacy or with sexuality, and they just don't want to get into that again. So they are more integrated in their sexual sense of self. They've had sex, they've been married, they're often less secretive, or I would say conflicted by choosing to engage in sexual relations before marriage.
Before a second marriage, in other words.
Before a second marriage. But again, there are going to be people who are in even the modern Orthodox demographic that won't do that do believe that sex is for marriage, and they won't be having sex, or they won't be having intercourse. They might be doing other things, or they won't be doing anything. And that's certainly great too. I mean, it's whatever you choose, but whatever it is that you choose, you need to choose from a place of acceptance and responsibility. Because look, when we talk about splitting, we're also talking about people who are engaging in sexual activity without necessarily having discussion or education or a place to go to talk about issues like birth control, issues like boundaries, autonomy. How do I say no when I'm doing something that I don't really want to be doing? And so this is an area that's missing from conversation, and hopefully conversations like this will normalize. Singles also want to know about sexual functioning. Single people want to know, what if I have premature ejaculation? What if I'm going to have pain with intercourse? What they're told is it's not valid to talk about sexual problems until you're married. Once you're married, you can have a sexual problem. But many people are very aware of themselves, and they are concerned going in that they have something that they want to be able to treat, and there isn't proper validation for going to address these conditions and experiences.
This has been going back for a long time, Talli. When I was a high schooler in the mid-late 80s, age was the big discussion, and there was such a question about should parochial schools, whether they're Jewish or Catholic, talk about safe sex? Because on the one hand, by not talking about it, by talking about the need for a condom if someone's going to have sexual intercourse, then you're obviously potentially preventing a very, very serious disease. But on the other hand, the religious authorities that run these parochial schools are afraid, with good reason perhaps, that by talking about it, they're going to be validating it and permitting it perhaps. I'm not saying that was the right move, but from their perspective, they say if we're going to talk about sex, it's implicitly saying you can have it.
So this is an important conversation, and it's an important conversation for high school or seminaries or yeshivas, but I'm not talking about that demographic.
Right.
I'm talking about an older demographic. And if you have to stunt your sexual sense of self, then that's also, you're going into marriage with a very strong system of brakes. We talk about sexuality as having a system of brakes and a system of accelerators. And healthy sexuality is about being able to regulate and balance between inhibition and excitation. You're talking about people who have had their foot very strongly on the brake for a very, very long time. And then you're saying, okay, now you can go ahead and have sex. And they might be in their mid-30s or 40s. Obviously, when you've had your foot on the brake of sexuality, or your sexual sense of self has not been validated, or you have experienced sexuality with yourself or with other with a great deal of conflict or shame or guilt, these are unprocessed issues that you're bringing into the marriage. Often I'll see couples who wonder if the fact that there was sexual activity before marriage is what is causing their sexual problems. They feel a great deal of guilt for any sort of premarital sexual activity. Maybe this is why. I'll often have people who are Bali Tshuva who weren't even religious. But when they're religious and they get married because they had sex in college, this must be why they're having trouble. So it's almost like a acquired guilt about sexuality that came with becoming a Baal Tshuva, I guess. So there's really a lot that we need to be able to expand in our discussion of sexuality. We need to be inclusive. We need to be accepting. We need to be inclusive in discussions about masturbation. We can't avoid that discussion with single people. They want to know. They don't know where to go. They don't know where to go to talk about whether they're normal or not. And we need to be able to provide those spaces.
At least for me, Talli, even this podcast itself has been very enlightening. People have written to us with some very private issues, and I appreciate every letter that comes in. And I've received an education in terms of the real lives of people who are genuine, who are very interested in leading Torah or halachic or religious lives, and there are difficulties that accrue to simply being an unmarried person that it's very nice to say, well, you just can't do it. Life is a lot more complicated than that.
One issue that comes up is how do we discuss sexuality in a relationship, in a new relationship? Many singles will talk about how they will choose to fool around or won't choose to fool around, but there isn't really a discussion or a processing of it. So there's different categories. There's the category of fooling around and then never hearing from the person again because there's all this guilt and shame about it. And if I fooled around with you, then you're not who I want to marry. And then there's relationships that are really going in a very good direction. And there is a natural desire, because it is natural when there is a building of emotional intimacy, to want to get closer physically. How does that take place? I'd like to say that one person will initiate a respectful conversation by staying curious and open and asking about it. So I think that this is an important take-home point, that singles should be able to, when you get to that point, or that what you might call that awkward phase, to talk about it. Is it okay if I hug you? What's your stance on touch? I want to know, would I be disrespecting your boundaries if we chose to touch, and what would those boundaries be?
Well, I think communication is always probably the best recipe. That can never be a bad thing to communicate. I would assume that an important take-home is that couples should be communicating. If they don't, and if they eventually get married, there's going to be some problems down the road, simply because if they weren't communicating, the husband and wife are not necessarily who they thought they were, because they weren't really talking about these issues that actually are an important part of their lives.
It's not so much that they're not who they thought they were. It's more that the things that they didn't talk about then come up in the marriage. For example, one couple that I was working with, he really did not want to engage in touch, and he felt that he had to because she had been in a previous relationship where she had, and he apparently felt as though he blamed her on some level. Even though he took full responsibility, there was a part of him that needed to mourn for the yeshiva guy who he really thought was going to go to the chuppah, having never touched a woman, and that was gone from him, and he had to do a bit of a process.
I'd like to move on to a different question, though, which you and I talked about before we went on the air. We were talking about a problem that some singles have, particularly older religious women who believe in greater participation in Jewish life. That can stretch anywhere from being somewhat egalitarian in their beliefs about prayer, even to something which would be considered more quote-unquote traditional, like women's Torah learning, or doing things fully within a regular traditional halachic framework, but trying to find ways within that framework for women to be more participatory. Let me read a letter from one of our listeners who addressed this particular issue. She writes, "A core frustration among the unmarried women in my group of friends is what seems to be a lack of open-minded or liberal-thinking religious men. Women find that being Orthodox and a feminist conflicts with a lot of religious men's views on masculinity or women's issues, etc. I should maybe clarify that this is an issue that drives a lot of religious women to date traditional or secular men." I assume by traditional she means not fully Orthodox. Meaning they feel forced to compromise on their religious practices in order to find a mate, whether that means going a lot less or maybe a lot more religious. So, Talli, how would you answer someone like that?
Wow, thank you to our listener who exposed that. It's got to be really hard to feel like you have certain values that you are committed to, and then when you date men who are Orthodox, who are religious, and you bring your authentic self to the table, and then you find out that they're not interested in continuing to date a woman with such strong feelings or opinions, that's got to feel like a bummer. But that also means that that might not be the guy for you. Look, I think that whether it's about Orthodox feminism, or whether it's about living in Israel, or whether it's about politics, when people meet each other, there's an expectation to share core values and beliefs. And often people tend to meet each other around those core values and beliefs. When we talked before about the triangle of love, when couples begin at the stage of passion, they often gloss over the issues having to do with certain values and beliefs. And so by the time they reach the stage of intimacy and those beliefs come to the fore, then there becomes some struggles around that. But on the other hand, it's actually quite healthy to go in a relationship from a place of togetherness where we share core values to a place of differentiation. What I mean by that is that two people do not have to believe the exact same things. And so it should be okay for a woman who holds more feminist views to make it work with a guy who is more traditional minded, so long as there is the opportunity to talk to one another, try to understand one another. You know, we did a podcast, Scott, several months ago on when your partner goes off the derech and how you can maintain your relationship and even have an enhanced relationship when you get to a place of differentiation, when you can each hold your own beliefs and your own values, but more than that, where your partner can stay really curious and want to know more about your core values and beliefs.
I suppose we just hope that more of the men who are troubled perhaps by women who hold feminist values will be listening to this podcast, that they know that it's possible for them to continue to go out without rejecting them outright. Because what you're saying is that, yes, it can work, but I think what the listener was suggesting was that it may or may not work, but they're just not interested in going out in the first place, or they're not interested in continuing in.
Right. And I think that if you basically like the person, you might not want to invalidate the relationship right away because of differences of opinions until you kind of get deeper into trying to understand what's behind their hesitation or their concerns. There are men who may actually have some amount of anxiety around the idea of women's feminism, and so they had come out really strong against it from the get-go, but once they understand your sense of passion and desire for being part of something, they may end up being fine and really understanding it and wanting to know more about what makes you tick.
I obviously don't know about any individual man who reacts in any given way, but I would think that the most important thing for that man to absorb is to understand that, assuming this is the case, the person who espouses these feminist values is not coming from a place of trying to undermine belief in Torah and halacha, but rather from a love of Torah and halacha, from a place where she wants greater participation, not because she rejects it, but because she likes it so much. Understanding that, even if he disagrees and continues to disagree, at least the fundamental value of respect and love for Torah and God and Judaism is still there for both of them, which can make the transition or the connection a little bit easier, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that if one of your former students came to you and said, I'm going out with this great girl, and I really like her, and I like everything about her. The only thing that troubles me is that she likes to participate in a partnership minyan. And you were to say to him what you just said, I think we also need to acknowledge that men don't get asked questions as to the rationale behind their religious practice. It seems that it's still only women who have to rationalize why they want to do what they do. However, your response to him will allow him to kind of look deeper into what it is that's bothering him. Because often there's just an anxiety there about being controlled or the slippery slope.
And Talli, that slippery slope can mean different things, and it's different slippery slopes for different people. Some people have a slippery slope because they're misogynist. Other people have a slippery slope because they don't understand that a given woman is actually extremely committed. They think it symbolizes a lack of commitment. And for that person, what he'd need to understand is that, no, this is not a lack of commitment. It's greater commitment. It's greater love for Torah than otherwise would be expressed, perhaps, assuming that's true. But on the other hand, we have to understand each person has to look inside him or herself to understand, why am I reacting this way? Maybe it's an appropriate reaction. Maybe this person is the wrong person for me.
Absolutely.
Maybe I won't be able to handle this.
Yeah,
but on the
and
other
maybe
hand,
they should break up.
And maybe they should. On the other hand, maybe it's something which, if I look deeper, it's my own problem or something else is bothering me, not actually this issue, and that can be overcome.
Yes.
Obviously, Talli, there's a lot more to talk about. We just scratched the surface. Beyond all the very specific issues we talked about, regardless of whether we're talking about sexuality within the singles community, regardless of whether we're talking about dating for singles, for me, one of the big takeaways from our conversation today is really for people in positions, public positions, where they're going to be asked questions by singles or others. as I've said repeatedly throughout this podcast, I think that a lot of rabbis or other halachic authorities are scared that by entertaining such questions, by allowing these conversations to take place, we are implicitly approving of behavior that is not halachic, such as premarital sex. As I've said before on this podcast, there's an importance of distinguishing between approval and acceptance. We can not approve of certain behavior. That doesn't mean we can't accept the individual at all. It also means that we have to be open to having these conversations so that the person, whoever that person may be, feels comfortable coming to us with these questions so that, as you've said, it's happening. We have to keep this distinction between approval and acceptance in mind. And let me take it one step further. Even when I say that someone coming from a halachic perspective isn't going to approve of certain behavior, that doesn't mean we're judging either. There's a Gemara at the very last parak of Masechet Sanhedrin. It discusses the king Menashe, who's one of the final kings of the first Beit HaMikdash, considered the epitome of wickedness. It says, describing him in the Tanakh, that Jerusalem was filled end to end with blood. He was the ultimate in idolatry. In Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Kuf Bet Amud Bet, the Gemara reports that Rav Ashi, one of the great Amoraim, sages of the Talmud, saw King Menashe in a dream. And after engaging in a halachic discourse with him, he said to him, "If you're so smart, why did you commit idolatry?" To which Menashe answered, "If you had been there, you would have lifted up the hem of your robe so that you could run right after me to worship idols as well." Which is another way of saying, don't judge me. You don't know what it was like. Does this mean that idolatry is okay? Of course not. Does this mean that we're approving of Menashe's behavior? Of course not. But it also means don't be so quick to judge. I think that clergy, halachic scholars, rabbis, teachers have to keep this in mind, that we may not approve, but we have to also be sure not to judge them either.
I think that fear that you were talking about of legitimizing or validating discussions around premarital sexual behavior in singles is part of what contributes to the isolation of singles who feel that nobody really understands, or they don't have a place to be able to bring their distress. My sense in talking to many singles is that they feel very alone and very isolated, and they don't have anybody to talk to because they don't get the sense that people in the world who are married, and most people in the community are married, people come to events as couples, as families, and they don't often get validated or understood for how they are living their lives without the fulfillment of one of the most basic needs of humans, which is to connect and to express love and to feel gratified with another human being.
I hope this podcast goes in some way towards opening these conversations so that singles will feel less alone, that people in positions where they can help them out will do so, and perhaps the community can come together to make a more integrated and accepting community. Talli, that concludes this very partial but I think important discussion of singles. What are we talking about in our next episode?
It's going to be Tishrei. It is the 10 days of repentance coming up between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And this is a time of self-reflection. I'd like to talk to you, Scott, about the process of tshuva, the relationship that each of us has with God, and how that may serve as a template for our intimate relationships.
Sounds great. So thank you all for listening once again to episode 1 of our second season of Intimate Judaism, episode 14 overall. We appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. Please make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, where you can get full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. Please send us your questions, comments, anything else you want to tell us to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to hearing your comments on this episode. See you next month.